This is the eLearn podcast. If you're passionate about the future of learning, you're in the right place. The expert guests on this show provide insights into the latest strategies, practices, and technologies for creating killer online learning outcomes. My name's Laddick, and I'm your host from Open LMS. The eLearn podcast is sponsored by eLearn Magazine, your go-to resource for all things online learning. Click-by-click how-to articles, the latest in edtech, spotlight on successful outcomes and trends in the marketplace. Subscribe today and never miss a post at elearnmagazine.com. And Open LMS, a company leveraging open source software to deliver effective, customized, and engaging learning experiences for schools, universities, companies, and governments around the world since 2005. Learn more at openlms.net. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the eLearn podcast. My name's Laddick, as you've heard. But as I like to remind everybody, this show is not about me. It's about my guests who are here with me today, Kevin Perry and Norina Columbaro. Very nice to have both of you. As I like to do, I'd like to start up by just kind of figuring out where you guys are in the world. Let's start with you, Norina. Where are you?
Oh, I'm in Oregon, out on the West Coast, the USA. Yep.
All right. Well, I know that, for those who are going to watch the recording of this, it's early for you. So thanks so much for getting
all good. It's all
Appreciate
good.
that. Excellent. All right. And Kevin, where do we find you?
I'm in Pittsburgh, PA.
All right. Well, then it's not so early for you. It's your day's already half over. Fantastic. One of the things I still love, and I'm going to show all my gray hairs here, that we can connect all of the parts of the globe at the same time here. We're going to talk about learning assessment and what learning assessment means, and a study that both of you performed about what's actually effective, right? What kinds of assessment are effective? But before we go down and get into the meat of this, I'd love for you guys to both set the stage, give us your background, tell us where you're coming from, and sort of who you are. Why don't we go the opposite direction here? Kevin, why don't you tell us who you are and who you represent and that kind of thing?
Sure. So I spent about 30 years in the continuing education profession, the first 10 of which were in the university setting. So I worked for a couple university continuing education departments where we conducted, essentially the night classes that adult learners attend. And then I switched to the technical association industry. So I worked for nearly 22 years for the Society of Automotive Engineers, which is a standards organization that sets standards for automotive and aerospace. And I worked in the training department where we conducted a wide variety of courses to keep those engineers current. I retired from my day job at the end of 2018. So for most of the past 5 years, I've been involved with this organization, IACET, the International Accreditors for Continuing Education, as a commissioner where I review accreditation applications. And I've had other involvements with IACET along the way, including serving on their board and some other things. These days I'm a retired continuing education professional.
Fantastic. Excellent. Norina, same opportunity for you. Why don't you set the stage for who you are?
Yeah. On the other hand, I am not retired. So I actually, my background is in research, in adult education and training and development. But I also am the owner and executive director of Performance for Life Consulting, which focuses on scientific and technical communication, as well as instructional design and accreditation. My business has been in operation for, almost 27 years now. So that obviously, I started when I was 10, as the joke is. And so I've had the fortune to work with a lot of different companies, probably about 60 different organizations over those years worldwide. And as far as IACET's concerned, like Kevin, I have served as a commissioner. I've worked in voluntary capacity on several committees. And also I'm an instructor for IACET. I've been teaching some workshops as well as contributing to their communications and blogs. And so I'm really excited to be here today with you, Laddick.
Fantastic. I'm excited to have both of you here. As I said at the top of the show, we're here to talk about learning assessment. And that's what IACET does, as an accreditation institution. But I want to make sure that we are all on the same page about the difference between sort of learning assessment versus evaluation versus outcomes, et cetera. Norina, why don't I give this one to you? What do we mean by learning assessment specifically in this case?
Yeah, thanks, Laddick. You know what? There's been a lot of going back and forth on this, rather. And when we talk about assessments, especially in the context of the research that Kevin and I worked on, we're speaking specifically about learning assessments. We're speaking specifically about, assessing the learners. That's where the focus is. It's not on the event, which is what we usually consider evaluation, okay, those terms. And the types of assessments that Kevin and I really focused on were mostly on what we call formative, and your audience, I'm sure, is already familiar. Formative assessments, anything that's happening during the learning event or experience to make sure that the learners are on track with their mastery of the learning outcomes, and if there's any type of coaching or intervention that has to occur. And then, of course, summative assessments, which are the assessments that occur near the end or at the end of the learning event or experience. And so that's what we mean by assessment. We're not talking about hiring assessments, anything else like that. It's strictly learning assessments and focusing on the learner's achievement of the learning outcomes.
Okay, cool. And then so on the other, I guess the same side of the same coin, Kevin, you mentioned that you've been with IASET for a while now. You both have conducted a study, and that's what we're going to talk about in more depth going forward. But I think it'd be worthwhile to give a little bit more background on what IASET is and how the accreditation process works, so that the study kind of can be put in context. Kevin, you want to take that one?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So again, IASET is the International Accreditors for Continuing Education and Training. And they're in the business of accrediting training providers against a continuing education training standard that they developed. So a training provider could be, an internal training department in a company that trains its employees or maybe its customers, or it can be a private training company that provides training courses for a specific target audience, or it could be a college or university. So to become accredited, the training provider has to submit this extensive application that verifies their compliance with this standard. Two reviewers called commissioners are assigned to the application, and they conduct reviews. And then the final step is what's called an accreditation interview that one of those commissioners conducts virtually. So once accredited, that provider must then reaccredit every 5 years to demonstrate their ongoing compliance with the standard. And I might add that IASET itself is an accredited standards development organization by ANSI, the American National Standards Institute, which gives their standard a high degree of legitimacy and credibility. So training providers choose to become accredited by IASET to raise their own credibility and to be able to issue the IASET Continuing Education Unit, or CEU.
All right. Thank you very much. Fantastic. Can you also, just before I start asking, can you put the study in context for us? Like, so, what would who could, I guess, did IASET commission it from you? Was this a proposal? And, what was the goal of the study that you guys conducted?
Yeah. So I guess, Norina, I can jump in and start an answer on that. I've been interested in learning assessment since way back in my career. We conduct all of these training courses, and I would periodically ask, are they really doing any good here? Are they doing what they were intended to do? And that interest just sort of stuck with me throughout my career. And, after reviewing dozens of these IASET accreditation applications, I started to notice patterns in the types of assessments that these providers were reporting in their applications. And it finally dawned on me, why don't I just do a deep dive and do an official study of this to determine exactly what's going on. So I reached out to my good friend Norina and asked if she'd like to participate with me in a more formal study of this. And we got permission then from IASET to have a look at more than 100 of those applications. So yeah, that's kind of where it started. And Norina took responsibility for a literature review and, kind of looking at the larger landscape. And then my role was the more focused deep dive on these 100 or so applications.
Fantastic. Thank you for the context there. So Norina, yeah, your part of the study was a literature review, as I understand it. And the literature review covered with the current state of how learning is being assessed by education and training providers. So what did you find, and what were the aha moments, I guess?
Sure. Well, Ladek, what I'm going to do is I'm going to preface this a little bit. This is not exhaustive literature review. And actually, what I was trying to find out is, what has been going on over the last even 20 years. It's not even the most recent way that we've assessed, because, I've been in this profession for quite a long time. And so I wanted to see, how it's evolved, basically, so that I could support whatever Kevin was uncovering as well, and see if we could compare and contrast with what's going on. And so some of the things that I saw that came out of it were, first of all, as we kind of level set at the very beginning, was there's different definitions or different ways of looking at assessments, right? And so that was one key finding, is that we're all over the board. And so that's why we kind of leveled it out and said assessment is focused on the learner, evaluation is focused on the course, right? And so that was one of the things that came out of that literature review. And I mean, I went back into 1984 to present day. So I really wanted to see, that evolution. And then, some other things that I thought were very fascinating from the literature review was that, obviously we're so used to associating assessment with our traditional ways of assessing, right? The exam, checking off that box, et cetera. And that there's so many other ways of assessing learner mastery, and more creative ways and more mindful ways of doing that. And so those were some of the things that emerged through the literature review. And again, a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about from the lit review that were emerging, and I use the term emerging from the lit review. They're not brand new ideas of assessing. But, it's just fascinating that we have some more opportunity to really find out if learners are mastering the outcomes. One thing that we found out was that, there are some assessment methods that are being used, such as simulations. And many of you are already probably using simulations as assessment, both for formative as well as summative assessment. But also, the emergence of gamification, using portfolios, especially with credit for prior learning. Storytelling is something that came across. I've been working with different types of populations, using storytelling as a means of assessing mastery of learning outcomes and really getting out of the box. And those are some of the things that I saw that emerged. Also, this idea of authentic versus traditional assessments, and really looking at, how can we assess the learners against what they're going to have to do back on the job, not just from the learning experience itself, but what do they need to do back on the job or in their lives, et cetera. And one of the things I do want to point out on the podcast that you had done with Amy Tessitore, I truly appreciated what Amy talked about with assessments, is that open book. That's authentic assessment, right? Because that's real life. We aren't memorizing things. There's job aids that are out there, et cetera. Another thing that emerged is more inclusive models of or ways of assessing learners. And this goes back to, being more culturally responsive. And those were some of the findings that emerged from the literature, as well as trauma-informed approaches. And I don't know if any of the listeners out here have test anxiety. I will share with you that I do. And so this was something that was particularly something of interest to me too, as well as accessibility, which I believe that Amy also talked about in the podcast. So I do have a list of the resources that we came across. And again, please, we want to make sure that the listeners do understand this is not exhaustive. We just started this process, but we're happy to share that list, as well as the methodology for the literature review and what we used for some of the key words and the sources. But when I get back to that word emerging, I hesitate to call these emerging assessment methods because they've been around forever. It's just that I think that we're starting to become more aware of them and integrating them into our L&D profession. So that
Fantastic.
kind of gives you an idea of the literature view. And that sets the stage for Kevin when he was looking at the IACID applications, and we could compare and contrast between what was out in the literature along with what he was seeing with the applicants.
Kevin, I mean, Norina just, she kind of just stole my thunder there. Fantastic. So over to you. Like, what did you find in the literature? Sorry, in the applications itself? You looked at more than 100 different applications, and what came out of it? What did you discover?
Yeah, so the sample turned out to be 111 applications, which were roughly split between initial accreditation and reaccreditation applicants. So because reporting methods of assessment are a required part of these applications, I was able to go in and suss out how they were purporting to assess their learners. So what I discovered across those 111 applications was I counted a total of 261 assessment methods in total, which indicates that on average, this sampling of training providers were using roughly 2.4 methods of assessment on average. So that was an interesting finding. And in fact, only around a quarter of those providers used only one method. I thought that was noteworthy that on average, at least this sampling of training providers are relying on a couple or more methods of assessment rather than just one. So when I looked at those 261 total assessment methods and began to classify them, I wound up with 17 unique methods. So let me just talk about those.
Okay.
Not surprisingly, the overwhelming method of assessment that emerged was exams, quizzes, or knowledge checks, right? The good old-fashioned multiple choice exam or knowledge check that you're faced with either while you're going through the course or at the end. In fact, 88% of these providers reported using some sort of exam, quiz, or knowledge check. But what was interesting is that right behind that was something called instructor questioning, where an instructor would conduct a Q&A session to sort of knowledge check how the learners were getting it. That was followed by activities and written assignments that had to be turned in and evaluated by usually an instructor. And then right behind that was instructor observation. So the instructor comes back into the picture again here, conducting some sort of observation of learners doing something. Then behind that were things like doing a presentation, self-assessment. That was interesting, that many providers were just inviting the learners themselves to self-assess. Then we saw things like skill demonstrations, right? So show me you can do something. Do a project and turn that in, engage in a case study. Then I saw gaming. You heard Norina mention that, followed by labs, video feedback. So let's videotape you doing something and give you feedback. Then what was interesting is supervisor assessment, supervisor observation, and peer assessment. So here, and these, have fairly low frequencies in terms of what I counted, but these are three examples of, third parties weighing in on how the learner has mastered the learning outcomes. And then finally, clear at the bottom was something called blog posting, which was certainly interesting. So just to kind of summarize all that, again, 88% of these providers used traditional exams or quizzes, but instructors observing, questioning, and discussing were sort of a close second. And then that was rounded out with a fairly robust variety of other methods like activities, assignments, projects, presentations, hands-on demonstrations. And again, interesting to note that on average, providers were using 2.4 methods of assessment. And then the final point I'd like to make is if we go back to the 261 total assessment methods that were cited, 107 of them, or 41%, were using assessment summatively, and 154, or 59%, were using them formatively, which tells us that it's very common for providers to use assessment to check learners' progress along the way, rather than waiting until the end of the course to conduct a summative assessment.
I love it. I love how this study kind of confirms that, it sounds like, at least in the sample that you've chosen, that, hey, wait, there's some good methodology here, right? There's formative and summative happening. There's a variety of assessments happening, and so the learners are being given multiple options of ways to prove that they've achieved learning outcomes and those kinds of. That's super great, good news, in my book, unless I'm misreading something here. Is there anything to indicate in either the literature review or the applications themselves why one, method was chosen over another? Is one, for example, is it because of one, a certain assessment method is just a really big, heavy lift for the instructor? It takes more time and those kinds of things. And there are easier options, or maybe is it the availability of resources, like you mentioned, video playback, like, although I guess all of us have these now, so you could quickly pick up a phone and stuff. But any insights like that? Norina, maybe I'll give this one to you.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I can't speak conclusively, but I will hypothesize. Can I do that at least? I have a feeling that's exactly it. I mean, these were mostly corporate applications too. And I think we've talked about this too, is that people, again, aren't, it's a different orientation as opposed to an educational, like a higher ed. And so I think formative assessments are probably going to be more frequent in the corporate application. And so that's why we're probably seeing more of those. And Kevin, maybe you can tag onto that or argue that hypothesis. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I would agree. And I would conjecture that one of the reasons that traditional exams and quizzes emerges as the overwhelming number one method used is that's what we're used to.
Right.
We grew up with that in our whole educational experience. That's sort of what we were exposed to. So that's what we know how to do as education and training providers. And there are all kinds of tools that have been made available to create, multiple choice exams and so forth. There are all kinds of diagnostics available to evaluate or analyze whether they're being effective. And then beyond that, I would say that it's probably sometimes challenging for providers, including their instructors, to get creative. That's more work to be creative and do some different things, employ other technologies, and it's more work. So it probably is no great surprise that we're still fairly well rooted in the traditional exam and quiz.
Yep.
Go ahead, Norina.
Oh, no, I was going to say, yeah. And I think and actually that could be a misconception. I mean, there's ways that we can still do both, right? I think we can still be creative. One of the things that I found in the lit review was there was this idea of escape room. And I know that for some people that creates some anxiety right there. But the idea of escape room, sometimes we have the perception that would be a really heavy lift for an instructor to put something like that together to assess someone, right? Because when we think of escape rooms, they're pretty sophisticated. But, in the lit review, they showed us one of the sources there, how to do a low tech one that doesn't require a lot, but really does focus on the learning outcomes, really the learning, not getting distracted by the assessment, that detracts from the learning, but actually the learning outcomes. And so there are some ways that we can be, keep it simple, right? And still be impactful with our assessment.
Along that same line, talk to me about how much of a cultural cross section that we had in this? Like, do different parts of the world, again, first of all, are these applications coming from around the world, or is this totally North America, or Western world centric? And if so, do things play out differently in the African context, or in the Australasia context, or Latin America, where I am? Norina.
That's a great question. And unfortunately, that was one of our limitations with this study, is that we had primarily Western ways of thinking. And that's one of the challenges that I would put out to our audience here, is if we're going to keep moving forward with looking at some different ways of assessing, that we really need to look beyond the Western ways. And Kevin, I don't know if you want to weigh in on our sample. That was one of the challenges that we found with our sample population too.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the overwhelming majority of our applications were from the U.S., but we did have some Mexico, Puerto Rico, and some Middle East. And the only slightly significant finding that I was able to suss out is that it seemed as though in the training providers who were ISET accredited or seeking accreditation from the Middle East, they were more likely to use exams and methods as their one and only assessment method. I mean, they were heavily rooted in that. And at least in terms of the few applications we had from that area, that's all the further they went. But beyond that, there were really no significant differences between the US and the sprinkling of applications we had from outside the US.
Okay, fantastic. Tying this all together, what are the recommendations that come out of this study for either individuals who are listening right now, for institutions who are applying to ISET in the future, to learners and instructors writ large around the world about what assessments to use? Norina, why don't you start us off? Like, what kind of recommendations do you guys have?
Absolutely. That's my biggest thing right there. What I just said is that we need to do a more thorough job of looking at some non-Western ways of assessing, really broaden our view. And that's what my hopes are, is that we continue this investigation of this literature and also do more exploring and being open to that. So that would be my recommendation to our listeners and anybody in the learning and development field.
Fantastic. What about you, Kevin?
So what I would add to that is, for those who choose to stick with traditional testing, meaning exams and quizzes and so forth, be aware of cultural bias, and if possible, invest in some knowledge and assistance to try to make sure your exams are as non-culturally biased as possible. And then also on the back end, once those exams are deployed, analyze the results with validity and reliability analysis tools. Some of that can be relatively simple or much more complex, depending on how in depth you want to go. And there are certainly, experts that can assist with that, but it's worth at least doing an item analysis every now and then to see if there are patterns in questions being consistently not answered correctly. That typically tells you there's something wrong with the question. And then finally, I would add, be mindful on the front end when you're designing your course of your learning outcomes. So don't promise what you can't realistically measure. But be mindful of what those learning outcomes are promising that the learner will be able to know or do at the end. Because if you're promising something that is just not realistic in terms of measuring it, whether it's with an exam or some other assessment method, then that learning outcome should really be rewritten.
Fantastic. Once again, I'm always so surprised at how quickly a half an hour goes here. But Kevin and Norina, I can't thank you enough for taking time out of your, early morning and your, late morning to speak with us about this this study that you've done through ISET. It's been extremely interesting. I love the just how much it provokes so much thought for those of us in the education space about, how are we judging our learners? How are we testing mastery and those kinds of things? What sounds like a great start, and real promising, beginning to a much longer conversation. So thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. If people want to reach out to you, what is the best way for you? Norina, what's the best way for people to reach out to you?
Absolutely. Well, start with ISET, of course. But I will also put my contact information in the chat. Either through LinkedIn, Norina Columbaro, that's one other way that we could do that too. So, and then as I mentioned, we do have the list of references as well as the methodology for the lit review. If anybody's interested in that, I have that available too. And I'm going to put my email up there too.
Fantastic.
Okay.
And then Kevin, what about you?
Well, I just put my email in the chat, but to reiterate, I can also be tracked down through iset.org, and would certainly encourage anybody tuning in to check out iset.org at some point to take a look at the standard and maybe consider becoming accredited if you aren't already.
Super cool. Thank you very much. Thank you once again to both of you. I wish you the best day, and we'll talk to you again sometime soon.
Sounds good.
Thank you.
Thanks, Laddick.